You're watching World Insight. We start with the ongoing PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games. After a dramatic easing of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the day seeing the DPRK and South Korea walk under a united flag again had finally come. South Korea held the opening ceremony for the 23rd Winter Olympic Games at the PyeongChang Olympic Stadium on Friday night. Around 3,000 athletes from all over the world will compete for 102 gold medals in 15 sports from the 9th to the 25th of February. The games are called Peace in Motion. Although on the eve of the opening ceremony, Pyongyang held a military parade. So how did it affect inter-Korea relations? Will this Winter Olympic Games make a difference? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Finally, the curtain on the Games have been raised. The opening ceremony of the PyeongChang Winter Olympics started a bit past 7 p.m. Friday in South Korea's northeastern county. South Korea and the DPRK marched under one banner at the ceremony. South Korea is calling the event the Peace Olympics, and the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressed the message of peace when he met with IOC President Thomas Bach in PyeongChang.
Obviously, in the present context, there is a lot of attention for this message of peace in relation to the Korean Peninsula. But I want to say very clearly that the Olympic message of peace is not local, it's universal. It's for the whole world. It's as valid in Korea as it is valid everywhere where we struggle to try to address the many complex conflicts that we are facing.
Although, on the eve of the Games, the DPRK flexed its military muscle with a parade coinciding with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence's words that Washington would soon unveil its toughest sanctions ever on the DPRK. Mr. Pence also arrived at PyeongChang for the opening ceremony. Meanwhile, DPRK leader Kim Jong-un sent a high-level government delegation, including his sister, to attend the opening ceremony. Kim Yo-jong is the first member of the DPRK's ruling family to visit the South since the 1950-53 Korean War. The DPRK officials during their three-day visit will also meet South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who's trying to turn the Olympics as a chance to pull Pyongyang into meaningful talks over its nuclear program. Could his wish become a reality?
So are the PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games about far more than just a sport? Let's turn to our panelists. In Beijing, Dongjun Paodong, who is a sports podcaster with A China Limited, the official commentator of the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games. Welcome to our program. In Washington, D.C., we have Eric Farnsworth, Vice President of the American Society and also the Council of the Americas. In Medford, we again invited Sung-Yoon Lee, Kim Kook Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School of Tufts University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Let's celebrate, the beautiful opening of the PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games. Certainly, this is a moment for celebration. However, Professor Lee, besides the unified flag, how much are you reading out of the footages you watched earlier about the Winter Games?
Well, if this spectacle, the warm feelings between North Korea and South Korea displayed at the world's biggest stage were a first, if it were the first time we're observing this, I would be very, very excited myself. But we have seen this movie several times before, in 2000, 2002, 2003, 2005, when North Koreans and South Koreans marched together in the Sydney Olympics in 2000, when North Korea used to send hundreds of athletes and female cheerleaders, thus mesmerizing the South Korean public while marching to its drumbeat of nuclear weapons development. Well, the momentum is clearly on North Korea's side, and I think right now for the U.S. Vice President and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan to play the role of the Grinch, coming across as grumpy old men, saying that North Korea is doing this as a ploy, a charade, hijacking the games and so forth, this is not very helpful. North Korea is exuding a very soft image in sending Kim Jong-un's sister to South Korea, and Moon Jae-in and Kim Yo-jong, the sister, and Kim Yong-nam, the 90-year-old ceremonial head of state, will dine together tomorrow. While this is going on, I don't think it's in the interest of the United States coming across as the party pooper.
Okay. Professor Lee, obviously, with decades of studying of the Korean Peninsula, has a lot to say today. One could tell from the very first answer he's providing already. But let me go to you, Mr. Farnsworth. A lot of skepticism? Anything to celebrate about?
Well, I think there's always celebration around the Olympics, whether it's winter or summer. There's a sense of hope that the world will at least temporarily put aside its most difficult political questions and at least for a couple weeks celebrate human achievement through sports. That's always the hope. I think generally speaking there's always some disappointment in that because you can never really get away from politics, and as Professor Lee was saying, that's doubly true on the Korean Peninsula. So I think we have to look at this as a hopeful moment but not suggest perhaps that it's going to make a permanent change one way or the other.
Paul, here in Beijing, Olympics has never been away from politics. Let's just be pragmatic here and frank here. Think about this year's Olympic Games. This is happening with the background of IOC corruption cases. This is happening when there is a dispute between Russia and the IOC about whether doping is a big problem with the Russian team. And Russia believes, at least from their perspective, that this has a lot to do with politics between Russia and the West, so-called. And thirdly, of course, there's North and South, whether unified flag or not, there's a big backdrop of the nuclear issue going on. So even this game alone, you have different layers of politics already piled up. Politics has never been away from sports, right?
Especially for the Olympics, which differentiate itself from other major sporting events like a world championship of football, ping pong, but the Olympics is very special. I mean, it's a great get-together of athletes from around the world, especially during a low time of globalization for the economies, and people are questioning about the globalization, but the Olympics in such a difficult time can serve as a great platform for people to uphold their common value and their shared spirit and their pursuit for highness and for greater, stronger, and faster. So I think although
probably
the Olympic
movement
also experiences its own difficulties and controversies, I think it's very important for them to uphold the Olympic flag.
Well, you think about that, Mr. Dong, here in Beijing. I want to push up a little bit about that. China, Beijing, together with the other surrounding cities, trying to host the next Winter Olympic Games. So this is going to be not only about North and South Korea, it's about a prelude to the Beijing Winter Olympic Games. This is a big thing for China. Mr. Dong, how is China preparing so far? When looking at the opening ceremony, which you did tonight, what do you think?
Well, actually, China realizes how difficult, what a challenge it would be within 4 years, just another 4 years, to put together the Olympics in which the winter sports, most of the highest level of winter sports have never come to China for a big event. So China is trying to make the most of the convenience of being a close neighbor to PyeongChang, to send as large a delegation as possible to observe almost every detail of the entire thing, without paying too much attention to the political implications surrounding the Olympics. They are paying attention to how to manage various challenges and crises, including the recent sick problem that a lot of
that is going on right now. There's already more than 100 people sick right now, but also only about staff, not necessarily about sportsmen and women there.
Absolutely.
So what a blessing so far, but we'll see how things will go. But Mr. Farnsworth, China wants to have 300 million people doing winter sports, just to have a big enough foundation for people to play winter sports, and also big enough an interest group for people eventually to support the Winter Games 4 years from now. But Mr. Farnsworth, look at that number. It's like astronomical. Will China be able to do that, given your expertise about sports and also about organizing sports?
Well, it is a very large number, no question about it. 300 million is the size of the entire United States population, so that is clearly something that is a challenge, but we have to put it in perspective as well. The Chinese overall population is much larger than that as well. There's nothing like the Olympics to bring a national spirit and a national sense of accomplishment to a country that wants to host the games. And we've seen this repeatedly through various countries, and the nations that host the games tend to do very well in them. I think perhaps of the Winter Olympics in Vancouver in 2010, where Canada actually had a national project called Own the Podium to try to get Canadian athletes to medal at the Vancouver Games, and they were very successful at that. And of course, Canada is a northern hemisphere nation. It does have a very rich and long history of winter sports, but this is clearly something that can be used to develop sports in China as well. Or I think of the World Cup that the United States hosted in 1994, the United States not being necessarily a soccer-playing nation or football-playing nation, and yet that really helped develop the sport develop in the United States. I would see this clearly as something that the Chinese would be able to develop, and the fact that the Olympics are occurring right now so close to China gives the Chinese people a very good exposure to what they might be able to expect. And I would be very interested to see what is the size of the viewership, for example, on television in China of the Winter Olympic Games right now. That would give a very good indication of
me
the
about
importance.
that.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Mr. Dong, but on the other hand,
that's exactly my point.
It's enormous. Mr. Dong, though, there's another thing that is, 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, China first time hosting a Olympic Games. There's enormous amount of enthusiasm. You yourself included. You were there, volunteer every day. But think about it, Mr. Dong. For the Winter Games, it's going to be different. It's going to be another time China hosting the Olympic Games. So the feeling is going to be very different. And China does not necessarily need another international event to prove to the rest of the world that we are here, we are on the center stage. China's already there anyway, Mr. Dong.
Well, when you talk about 2008, don't forget that China topped the medal tally table above the United States. That demonstrates that within just 20, 30 years, China could reach that high from knowing nothing, almost nothing about the Olympics. But don't forget that actually China's first ever participation in modern Olympics was actually in the Winter Olympics prior to Los Angeles in 1984. That also means that China paid not enough attention to developing winter sports. And now the top Chinese leadership realizes the importance of, by inviting into the winter sports to create more cultural enthusiasm among the public to pursue among themselves, and at the same time to create more business opportunities and job opportunities. I think by looking at the past history of China from the Cultural Revolution to a nation embracing market economy, and by reaching such a height in the economy and as well as in sports, you don't have much doubt about China's capability of reaching that high. You don't have to calculate or count.
Just to be fair, I already sense that sense of enthusiasm in your voice, Mr. Dong, when it comes to winter sports or any sports here in this country, Olympics or whatever. But I sense the same kinds of enthusiasm earlier in the voice of Professor Lee when we talk about the North and South interactions possibly happen during the Winter Olympic Games. So Professor Lee, let me go to you once again about that topic. We heard the two colleagues already talk about the next level of the Olympic Games, but for this year's Winter Game, North and South relationship, how much of that do you think is going to occupy the headline? Will there be more headliners in the future than the handshakes and the lunch?
Well, in line with our discussion, the Olympic Games as a coming out party to show the world how far you have come, how much you've developed as a nation, as an economy, and so on. 30 years ago, South Korea hosted the Summer Olympics, and that was a big deal. Koreans were very proud and excited, and North Korea acted cravenly by blowing up a Korean civilian aircraft on November 29th, 1987, about 9-10 months before the opening ceremony, to discourage people from coming to South Korea. Back then, South Korea was annoyed, but North Korea did not have nuclear weapons. In the intervening years, South Korea's status and power, wealth have all increased. South Korea is more self-assured in many ways, but ironically, South Korea has become more dependent on North Korea's goodwill due to North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities and threat. But more to the point, because South Koreans have gotten a taste of North Korea's warmer side. Whenever North Korea reaches out to South Korea using their carrot, puts on a charming face, like sending Kim Jong-un's sister to South Korea, South Koreans are very excited and they don't want to let that go. So it's a bit ironical that South Korea today is more eager to please Pyongyang, and the government is really according VIP treatment to the North Korean delegation.
I see.
Treating Kim Yo-jong like a princess, I guess she is. But, you know, her job title is the head of the Department of Propaganda and Agitation, which at least suggests that she is very good at exuding a warm image, as are the North Koreans.
All right. Professor Lee mentioned several facts in history. Let's take a look at some of those facts. A South Korean airliner blew up ahead of the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games in an apparent attempt to dissuade visitors. Pyongyang boycotted Seoul's Olympic debut on the world stage. Fast forward 3 decades later, PyeongChang gamely took part in PyeongChang Olympic Games with contingent of cheerleaders, Pyongyang take part in the PyeongChang Olympic Games with contingent of cheerleaders and also performers. The DPRK leader also sent sister to the games, unprecedented visit of a member of their family, and also high-level government delegation. However, here's the thing, Mr. Farnsworth. Given that there is still a minor hope that all sides could interact with one another, even though we do not know what would be the result of this interaction, how much hope do you think we should have?
Well, I think we have to have hope, but I think it has to be measured by a realistic assessment of what this actually means. It's fascinating to me, in fact, the goodwill that North Korea is achieving by taking absolutely no risk whatsoever. South Korea took the risk to win the games, to build the facilities, to pay the cost, to take all of the effort to put on the games. And North Korea has put on a charm offensive and sent a high-level delegation. And now, instead of the South Korean games, these are now the Korean games and the peace games. And in some way, that's a huge victory for North Korea, because now they can claim that the games are in some way about them. It's a much more effective approach than blowing up airliners, which they did 30 years ago. So this, to me, is something that shows a sophistication, if you will, of the North Korean approach. And it's very easy to buy into that sort of thing and to say, well, in that case, everything has changed. Everything has not changed. This is a celebration of sport, and it's a short period of time, relatively. It's only a couple weeks, and we hope that it will lead to positive change on the peninsula. But at the end of the day, when the athletes go home and return to their home countries, nothing will have fundamentally changed necessarily on the Korean Peninsula, and I think that's what people will focus on going forward. In some ways, it's like what happened in Sochi after the Olympics concluded there. That did not change the situation on the ground, for example, in Ukraine, and yet many people overlooked that because they enjoyed watching the games, and then a short time later, Ukraine was in turmoil. And so there are some things here that I think we just have to be a little bit careful about putting too much hope into what is essentially a sporting event, although it's clearly an important sporting event.
Well, Kim Jong-un, the head of state coming from North Korea, is sitting right beside the South Korean president. Meanwhile, we also saw them doing handshakes in front of enormous amounts of cameras, probably more than any other time during the Winter Olympic Games. Well, at the same time, right in front of their lines, Kim Jong-nam and also the sister of Kim Jong-un, there is the line of the American delegation. Vice President Pence, together with his wife, was sitting over there. Very small distance, geographically, of course. Only 1 meter possibly. And yet, when it comes to the possibility of reaching consensus, we seem to be still feel the sea difference. Professor Lee, How do you see this huge contrast?
It's a PR trap, a PR debacle waiting to happen for the U.S. side. Many years ago, in 1954, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, in Geneva, snubbed Premier Zhou Enlai when he extended his hand to shake hands with a U.S. statesman. The Americans snubbed him, ignored him, and just walked right by in front of foreign observers from many other countries. We don't want something like to happen because it's not in the U.S. interest. It only favors North Korea's interests. Now, several weeks ago, I mentioned on this program that Kim Yo-jong will come, so will Ivanka Trump, and the two will have a sideline little chit-chat, tea time, and you said I was wildly imaginative. It's going to happen. So there is a little bit of a dilemma now for China. Because whom to send to the closing ceremony is a thorny issue for China. China, as the next host of the Winter Games, of course, will send a high-level delegation, a high-level official. But there is also the possibility that the South Korean government, President Moon, will invite Kim Yo-jong and Ivanka Trump and the head of the Chinese delegation all to dinner, and that will create perhaps positive optics. You know, it's a sensitive issue for the Chinese government.
The first part of your answer, Professor Lee, made me almost powerless to argue against the second part of your answer. Sorry I didn't agree with you earlier about who is likely to be invited by the South Korean side from North Korea. However, what is likely to happen when all the players are there? China said it very clearly, Mr. Dong here in Beijing, that China wants things to move in the positive direction. And China also said it very clearly, even a year ago by the Chinese foreign minister, that the final key to unlock the deadlock and the crisis of Korean Peninsula is not in China's hands directly. So how do we see China's role? That should be a question we need to answer, but the question is, how relevant will it be when these very active players, North, South, and the United States, are there, and they should make their efforts. Mr. Dong.
Well, when it comes to sports, during the Olympics, what China can do?
It's actually when it comes to politics, North and South Korea.
Well, when it comes to the diplomatic relations and then the Chinese positioning during this crisis period, I wish I could have more to comment on, but I do follow China Foreign Ministry's comments when asked about China's stance, and I haven't read or seen any major changes throughout the past year or a few months. So I believe that China will try to make the PyeongChang Olympics an opportunity as a sporting event, and as China being the very next host of in 4 years' time, China will be concentrating on one, giving the best performance, and delivering fair play, as the oath requires all athletes to follow. And at the same time, China will concentrate on presenting a impressive 8-minute demonstration about how Beijing will be like, as well as Shijiazhuang. And that's the job up to China's director, Zhang Yimou, to think about.
Are you already pre-planning about that? Well, we have already a lot of fanfares going on all at the same time for this year's PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games in South Korea. For now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us on this celebratory night. Dong-jun, Eric Farnsworth, and Sung-Yoon Lee. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.